a few thoughts on why we have made a key part of making Jesus known, financing the future sustainably. And then I'm going to hand over to Anthony, who's going to focus on the change that we're planning to the share scheme. And then Anna is going to contribute some thoughts about how we're currently approaching support to giving and fundraising. And then the final part of the call will be a chance for further discussion. So we will pick up questions that you've posted as we go along relative to those three areas as well. Some of you may have been in archdeaconry level meetings that Bishop Stephen called in November, I think it was 2022, so best part of 15 months ago. And I remember Bishop Stephen at those pretty much to a round of applause, saying he was setting out a vision and strategy that meant we wouldn't have to talk about money anymore. And I think a sense that too much of church life locally and collectively is dominated by concerns about money for some very good reasons. And how can we get beyond that? So perhaps slightly counterintuitive to therefore make it one of the 5 priorities, but clearly positioning it as one of the 5 priorities to establish sustainable finance is so that we don't need to have it centre stage anymore, because our calling in mission and ministry is not about money. Money is there to resource us in our work with people and our stewardship of buildings and other activities, and therefore it's a tool for mission, and making Jesus known as a vision and strategy is fully mission led. You don't need me to tell you, and we all know it's a time of significant change in many aspects of life, and not least for the church. You will have seen the statistics for the church post-COVID, a 20% drop in church attendance after COVID, and that's obviously experienced locally in many contexts, not all, but in many parts of the diocese as well. And in many ways, an acceleration of some of the changes in the nature of church, with what's sometimes called a mixed ecology, people wanting to participate in church in different ways, perhaps in ways that are no longer familiar to many of us, or indeed not ways that are obviously linked to the giving of money. And how do we encourage people in their discipleship and giving and stewardship in ways that respond to that new reality? Because the tide isn't about to turn, and we need to find more creative ways. We share that challenge. What is the nature of ministry in a changed reality, and what are the costs associated with it? What does it mean to be the Church of England and to run a diocese with all of the statutory functions and requirements of being the Church of England? How do we lighten that and make that more efficient and effective in a changed time? These are the burning questions that inform our approach to our finances. In a moment, we're going to see a short film that Will help to make, which, just for a wider audience, tries to capture the sense of the cost, the financial cost of being the church, which is both local and also collective for the diocese. For me, the most important thing is that we're very straightforward about the costs, and we're also very clear about the opportunities to raise money. We do not live in a poor part of the country. There are opportunities to raise money and to invite people to give to things that they believe in. How can we make sure that we're confident in where the money is being spent and that the genuine needs of the church are being met in the services that the DBF colleagues of mine provide to the local church? All of this, as I say, is rooted in discipleship, because we believe that we're called to make Jesus known, and we're called to bring our loaves and fish in that powerful biblical story, the little perhaps that we have to offer as a contribution to that wider ministry. I think worth saying finally from me by way of introduction that whilst we do face big challenges, we are fortunate to have a number of resources to support a time of transition. You may have heard early last year, that the St Denys Foundation has given £1 million to the diocese to help mission, and our Aldhelm Mission Fund now has £1 million in it to support local initiatives in mission. That money is available for application. The National Church, through the Church Commissioners, have made money available to invest and support in mission and ministry, and we are able to access that funding for our work. There's also funding for work, particularly with our church buildings. And we know that for many communities, it's the rental of church buildings, church halls, that are a source of income. But the stewardship of historic buildings is a significant challenge. And we're looking actively at alternative ways to support that across the diocese. Other things there we can come back to later in the call together. I'm going to pause there, and Will is going to just run that short video, and then immediately after this, how is Share going to change, and what will you be sharing with the Synod on Saturday? Over to you. You're muted, Anthony.
Good. Well, first, that's a little logo that tells us what this is about. The new system should be transparent, simple, objective, mutual support, but rely with that heart of generosity at the middle. And because without that generosity, then we will not thrive as a diocese. So next slide, please. I'm going to just tell you the story of how we've got to this point and revising the system. Because when Fairer Share was first introduced 20 years ago now, for some of you who were around then, I helped introduce it. The big difference was that 50% of parishes were net contributors and 50% received support. And now that ratio has slipped to something nearer 30% contributors and 70% parishes being supported. And not surprisingly, the contributors are feeling the strain. It's not sustainable. In those days, our worshipping community was much larger, as you can see from those statistics. And that crucial average of 150 members per stipendiary priest has slipped now to nearer 130. And we hadn't adjusted that in the system. The modification factor, which was linked to affluence, was not very well understood, and increasingly in recent years has been a source of great irritation to parishes. And there was a perception that also the old system penalised growth, with the heavy emphasis on the number of members, and we used to dread the count each year to see how many fewer people there were, and it was starting to dominate the narrative. Next slide, please. And that was unhelpful. And I think partly with COVID, but also prior to that, with changes of personnel, we'd stopped educating people about the system. And I think therefore the comprehension of it and how it worked was beginning to disappear. And of course, there was that issue of the count and affluence, and a sense that some parishes were beginning to game the system, because it relied on everybody playing fair. And yet some people had cottoned on to the fact if they were conservative in deciding who they should include and conservative about their self-perception of their affluence, they could end up paying less, which wasn't really the idea of the system. And I say, with COVID, we couldn't do an accurate count. And so the last accurate count dates from March 2019, 5 years ago now. So clearly out of date. But next slide, please. So these the problems were had been flagged up before COVID, and we'd actually started looking at it in a working party during 2019. And that working party reported to Bishops' Council in February 2020. And of course, COVID hit after that, and the whole thing went into abeyance. So it wasn't until November 21 that we could pick up the process with a first survey, which we did. And we followed that up in the following July with a second survey of parishes, trying to glean from people and parishes what they wanted and what they thought was important about a new system. And what came across was a clear preference for a hybrid system, something that was part ministry cost and part mutual support. In actual fact, we noted from research with other dioceses that hybrid system stood up better during COVID than pure membership or pure cost systems. So that was something to bear in mind. People wanted transparency. They wanted clear principles and simple to understand. There was ambivalence about whether affluence should be a factor, and I'll say more about that later. At this stage, we were hoping that a system would be ready for January 2024, i.e. this year, but changes in personnel and various things meant that January 25 was a more realistic start point because of the problem. You do have to be able to design a system and then communicate well in order for people to understand it and buy into it, which is what we're intending to do for the rest of this year. Next slide, please. The very interesting bit of research came out that showed that actually only 40% of regular income for parishes came from direct giving. And actually, for most, an average of 60% of income for parishes came from investments, from letting of buildings, and from fundraising, like the village or the church fete. So, in actual fact, the affluence was less important from that point of view. Then we had research from the National Church, which showed that actually affluence made no difference to people's giving. In other words, the rich don't get rich by giving it away, if you like, is one way of putting it. But it's the old widow's mite that often it's the poorest who are proportionately most generous. Next slide, please. We modelled different versions of the hybrid system with the different percentages. We discounted affluence after that national research. We wanted to balance the needs of the urban and rural church because a pure cost system really benefits the urban church. Often when you have one building, you have a nice church hall you can let out for income, and it can disadvantage a multi-parish rural benefits where you might be looking after several grade 1 listed buildings. Having said that, of course, rural churches often have much greater support from their communities towards the upkeep of their building, but all the same, the weight of 7 or 8 buildings can be quite considerable on a benefice. The 60-40 mutual support coupled with rebating a proportion of fee income, we think also helps balance between urban and rural, because our rural churches, rural benefices are still doing more weddings and funerals, far more than you now see in urban contexts where quite often secular undertakers have started to step in as funeral celebrants and stuff. And many urban churches do very few funerals at all. And of course, ever since the liberalisation of the marriage laws, we're doing less and less weddings, particularly again in urban areas. So rebating a proportion of fee income helps the rural church and also validates all the time and work that priests put in taking those very special services in the lives of people. Services that are very missional, as we have seen. It's often when a funeral or a wedding has been done well, that people then come back to church. How were we going to do the mutual support element? Well, we thought we alighted on the worshipping community figure from the National Church, which has a national definition. And so people can't argue with it. It's up on the national website. It is what it is. Next slide, please. And I think this tells us what it is. I won't read all that. I'm sure you may have seen it in previous communication, but it's very similar to our old fairer share definition, but the main difference is that we're asking the people now to include their fresh expressions. Now, I realise for some people that feels like a burden because you think to yourself, well, we've got all these people coming once a month and they don't contribute anything. But at the same time, we're asking you to do that to find that this worshipping community figure is something you should be providing to the National Church in January of every year. And it's not going to be included for your as part of your sharers request until the following year. So you've got the full year, in a sense, to help disciple people. And given that many parishes pay over the course of the year, the full effect is delayed. But it is time to start including our fresh expressions and not just people who come to traditional Sunday services. It's part of who we are as a diocese now, and it's time to own that, I think. So that's the key difference. Next slide, please. This year, as I suspect you all know by now, we introduced a phasing in towards the new system because we recognise for 2020 to 2023, we were really just operating a percentage increase over the previous year's share. And where some parishes have experienced a dramatic loss of membership, and that was patently they were suffering. And so if you've lost more than 50% of your membership, you had no increase at all this year. And then if you had lost less than 8%, you had the full 8% increase in share, which was the 8% was the budget increase. But as I say, we've used other income to moderate that and phase it in, because those who've had the biggest loss of membership will see that compared with fairer share, their share assessment will go down. So this is a halfway house to help us move towards that goal. Next slide, please. So we're recommending a hybrid system, part cost, part membership. 60% of the share request is allocated to beneficiaries according to the ministry deployed there. That's the cost element. And 40% will be allocated according to their worshipping community, the membership element. No account taken of relative affluence, as I said before. Next slide. How might this work in practice? This is very much a theoretical example. If I say the share request in total was 10 million, so 6 million that would be allocated by cost, 4 million by members. I used this example before, and someone said, does that mean the diocese has a sneaking plan or a secret plan to reduce to 120 full-time equivalent priests? No, I just used 120 because it was an easy figure for purposes of this demonstration. So say 120 full-time equivalent priests. If the worshipping community, say, was 20,000, then the cost element would be 6 million divided by 120, which is 50,000 per priest. And the membership element would be 4 million divided by 20,000, which is £200 per member. So for parishes, one priest and a worshipping community of 100, their share of cost request would be 50,000 plus 200 times 100 people, which equals a total of, and that's 20,000. So 50 and 20 is 70,000. That's how it would work in practice. Very simple hypothetical example. Move on, next slide, please. This is a real world example. The share request for this year was 12.2 million. So that's 7.32 by cost, 4.88 by membership. Actually, we've got equivalent full-time of 159.3 priests deployed across the diocese. Our total worshipping community was 19,416. Amazingly, it went down by about 800 between July 23, between beginning of last year and July 23 when we asked you to check it. And I hope that isn't evidence that people are already thinking they can game the system. Because if you think about it, actually, if we are starting to include fresh expressions, that number should go up a bit. That's one of the reasons, one of the things we'll be saying to deanery standing committees to look at that. So the cost element would be 7.32 million divided by 159.3. So you get a cost element of just under 46,000 per priest. And then a membership element, it's that calculation, which comes in at £251 per member. So if you had one stipendiary priest and a house for duty priest and a worshipping community of what's this, of 125, the share request will be that divided by 1.33 and 251 by 100 times 125 people. That comes in at £92,500 would be that. Now, further complication, let's say this is a multi-parish rural benefice. So next slide, please. How would that 92,490 be distributed? Well, there's the worshipping community figures for each of the 6 parishes. And so the calculation is set out on the right-hand side there. Now, we're suggesting initially that it would be allocated according to the size of the worshipping community in each parish in the multi-parish benefice. We're saying to people that you count people only once and in what would be regarded as their home parish in that situation. And we will send an initial request out at the beginning of September, but it's open for those within the multi-parish benefice to come back to us and say, we'd like you to allocate it differently between us for various reasons. It could be that, say, parish D, in this example, does the fresh expression for the service for the entire benefice, in which case for them to pick up the whole cost of that would be unfair. So this multi-parish benefice might come back to us and say, could we please allocate this slightly differently? And we do that. And then that would be the basis on which we collected the share during the following year. Next slide, please. Other things, we're going to continue the discount scheme, increasing it to 1% next year from 0.5 this year. And this will be for paying in full by the end of January, or 12 instalments by direct debit, or actually now by standing order as well, on the basis, though, that the discount would only be allocated once the 12th instalment had been received. So it wouldn't be an upfront discount. Changes to deployment or pastoral organisation affecting a beneficiary will be notified by the 1st of July of the previous year. Some of that may have to be a judgment call if you're in the middle of reorganising some parishes, but it's important that we have a baseline at one point in time. As I best mentioned, requests made to parishes on Welshman community numbers and only count once, but I won't repeat myself. Share requests will be sent out in September, but again, the multi-parish beneficiaries may have got 2 months to notify us of doing it differently. And requests will be rounded to the nearest parent. For some reason, we used to send it out in pence. Move on, please. Next slide. This is one of the innovations is the use of the income on the stipends capital account to help subsidise really poor parishes and to assist parishes in temporary difficulty. Perhaps the lead off your vestry has been nicked or something, and parishes will be able to bid for assistance from this fund. Now, we've got the indices of multiple deprivation for our parishes, and we've got 15 parishes that are in the top quartile of deprivation in the country. And they will be automatically approached by their archdeacons to see if they wanted some assistance. Others will be eligible to request assistance from that. And we're talking about a fund of somewhere between 200,000 to 300,000 a year. And the stipends capital account, when set up in the 1950s, was actually to be used to subsidise ministry in poor parishes, because the income in those benefices was often very low, and this was a means of enabling ministry to take place in poorer parts of the country. So we will be going back to using the income very much for its original purpose. I mentioned about rebating prior year fees of weddings and funerals. People have said, what about vacancies? Shouldn't we stop paying if we don't have a priest? Well, we've had a policy always that we keep paying during a vacancy, because if we didn't, it would add 700,000 to the total share request if parishes stop paying in a vacancy. So it's another 7 to 8% increase on top of everything else would have to be picked up by those parishes who weren't in vacancy. And frankly, we can't afford that. Every parish goes into vacancy. The average is somewhere between 7 to 9 years a parish will go into a vacancy. So it comes around to everybody over the course of time. But we are saying now that if a vacancy goes into a second year, which can happen because there's a shortage of clergy and it's proving not as easy to recruit as it used to be, that where we've let the rectory or the parsonage in that case, then 75% of the letting income will be credited back in the second year. During the first year, it's usually recouping all the money we spent putting the house up to a good standard for what to be let out. We are going to have a 4-year transition period to smooth out the changes, and there's going to be a manual stroke rule book to be published like the old Fairest Share Guide. It's actually ready and will be going out after Synod, assuming Synod accepts these proposals on Saturday. Next slide, please. Modelling showed that 92 out of 126 beneficiaries, that's 73%, will see their share request go up or down by 20% or less over the 4-year transition period. That's 20% over 4 years, not 20% in any 1 year. So we feel that's a reasonable transition to go through. 17% of beneficiaries, 17 or a mere 13% would experience an increase of more than 30%. But many of these will be able to apply to the relief fund, so that will help them. And 39 beneficiaries, that's 31%, will see the share request fall, but only 6 of these by more than 20%. The phasing is over 4 years, and those who are getting reduction won't get that reduction until years 3 and 4, and that's what makes the transition actually work and provides enough to cushion those who are having to up their game. Next slide, please. We've checked that the 1/3 for house for duty and 2/3 for house for duty with half a stipend is a fair way of apportioning the cost. We've checked, for instance, we're renting out our typical parsonage for £2,000 a month. So that's 24,000 a year, which is roughly a third of what it costs to have a priest. It meets the desire for a system based on clear principles that's simple to understand, and that's consistent feedback I've had from people. The 60-40 split between cost and membership is a judgment issue, but most consultees thought it strikes the right balance. And lastly, in bold, we're deliberately moving away from the cost of a priest to the cost of being church in Salisbury Diocese in order to encourage a less transactional response from parishes. I think that's me largely completed, unless there's a few points on the next slide. That's just the timeline, which I think you're probably aware of. And then some concluding remarks. The new scheme is designed to ensure that every beneficiary contributes a realistic amount of costs involved being part of the diocese, whilst deploying clergy in our parishes is our major cost. So it's appropriate that this is linked to clergy deployed in any particular benefice. Equally, those with a larger worshipping community will have more contributors, so it's appropriate they pay more than a smaller congregation. And again, we trying to strike that balance between urban and rural, and the communicating and engaging audiences will be important if this scheme is going to be adopted, and people are going to buy into it and see the merit of it. So part of what we're doing today is to do that, and hope this is proving a helpful session for you. Thank you.
Anthony, thank you. And just to recognise, many on the screen in the meeting have contributed along the way to this thinking, and thank you for raising your voice at various stages to help in developing this approach. Let's pause for a few minutes. Debbie raised a question about allocation by parish and benefits, which I hope I've answered. Others, feel free to jump in with a clarification or a thought. As you would have seen, quite a lot of work has been done on this, but it's never too late to improve it. And certainly what we do know from experience across the country as a whole is actually it's less about the technical detail of the scheme and more about how people feel confident that it's fair and it's well communicated. So if it's not coming across clearly to you, or if you think there are glitches or things that need clarification or adjusting, it's super helpful to hear those, because over the coming period, we need to get better and more effective at communicating a new scheme. Anthony, I'll hand back to you. Can't see everyone at once. Feel free to post chat questions. Debbie's posted another one. And then feel free also simply to unmute and speak into the meeting. It'd be great to hear your voices. But Anthony, if you want to go to Debbie's second question first of all, then I'll throw it open.
Generally, yes, is the answer, Debbie. There are a couple of churches that have self-fund an associate priest in the diocese by arrangement with the bishop, and that's. But generally speaking, the vast majority of stipended half-time and house duty clergy are included in the scheme in that way. Yeah. Others
like to jump in, comment or raise a question, feel free to unmute and just speak into the meeting.
No, the stipendiary curates are not part of the share calculation. We take that as a cost for the whole church, if you like, in training future clergy, and so there's no share implication if your church has a curate, and that also means that we can place curates anywhere we like, as opposed to only being able to place a curate in a parish that can afford to pay the extra share. You see, so it gives us greater flexibility where we place curates, and it's a recognition that curacy lasts between 3 and 4 years, but then there's a lifetime of service to the church from those priests after that, and that's the payback for the wider diocese, if you like.
Thank you, Robin. Good question. Others like to come in.
And Anthony, I've got a couple of questions, if I may.
Please, James.
Yeah. So how does it work in terms? How does the application process work? Is one approach, or you just turn up and say we want, let's say we want, I don't know, sake of the argument, conversation we're having, we want to have a stipendiary priest on Littlemore where the post has been cut. How do we just apply for that? Are there certain criteria? How does it?
You do have a post in Littlemore.
We don't have what we had. And it's self-felt, and so that's not a conversation. But if we wanted to get back to where we were,
well, I think the first thing, you want to get back to where you would have to try and pay the share that you're currently being asked to pay. But basically, a benefice which includes an area of deprivation like Littlemore will be approached by the archdeacon, because Littlemore is one of the parishes that has the highest rate of deprivation. It's in that top quartile I was mentioning about. So you will be approached, as will, for instance, West Howe. I see Christine's on the call. They'll approached directly by your archdeacon. Others, we're sending a data collection form out shortly, assuming the scheme's adopted. And on that data collection form, we'll be asking for your latest worshipping community figure, if you haven't submitted it already to the National Church, because if you have, we'll get it from the figures if they're up on the national website. We'll be asking for your latest figure, but also there'll be a box in that to apply for relief. And then those forms will go to the Deanery Standing Committee. The Deanery Standing Committee would take a first look at them. They will query whether they think the worshipping community figure is right or not, if they've got concerns about it. But also they'll be asked to express an opinion on the request for assistance, so that there's a sense in which the local church and the deanery is able to input into that. And then the final decision on any assistance from the income on the stipends capital account will be taken by the Finance and Resources Committee.
Thank you.
James. Just to say, I think we're talking about the kind of share economy, and the conversation currently about the deployment of stipended clergy is kind of within that conversation with archdeacons and bishops. Also beyond the share economy, if you like, there are opportunities which Jonathan Triffitt is leading on to apply for national funding, which can support ministry in particular areas as well. So there'll be more said about that on Saturday at the Diocesan Synod, but deployment is also through potentially the national funding for the future, which is another consideration.
Will the slides be available? Yes, eventually. I'm not going to promise them in the next couple of weeks, because we want to refine them and get the right balance between the amount of detail and telling the story without not having them too long. So they will be a presentation that will be available to show to PCCs. We might well do that after we've done the archdeaconry, not roadshows. What's the word we're using? Archdeaconry meetings to help explain more about the share system. It's about trying to get the information flows in the right order so that it lands well. But there will be a slideshow like this available in due course at the right time.
Anthony, may I ask a question?
Please go ahead.
When looking at the worshipping community, I know there have been questions around this in the past, because it often refers to those who contribute financially to the church, but they are not part of our worshipping community, because some of them never darken the doors of the church at all unless taken in a box. Do they count or do they not count? I
can't remember the wording in the worshipping community's definition precisely on that point.
No,
I'm not going to diverge from that definition at this point.
It talks about the worshipping community, and it says, and this is, and it has several clauses, and at the end it sort of says those who contribute financially to the church, but as a single category. But I mean that would open a can of worms, I think, if one looked at that.
I think we're not departing from that definition. We're saying that is the national definition. It's clear as a bell as far as we're concerned. And if that's what it says, that's what it says. I mean, some of those people might be people in care homes who are receiving home communion, and in that
no. We know we have people who simply give mainly because they just want to see the church building kept upright, possibly. But I would not consider themselves to be part of our worshipping community.
Right. Well, all I say is the definition is there. It's that one, and any doubt, refer back to that, and it's down to your good conscience as to how you interpret it from there.
Thank you.
Can you say a little bit more, please, Anthony, about fresh expressions? I'm not really that clear on what that means.
It's things like messy church. People are doing muddy church these days. We've heard of there's bubble church about to start in one parish. These are forms of worship and activity that would not be, you wouldn't necessarily find them in the liturgy of the Church of England, the Book of Common Prayer, for instance, but they have been a feature of the last 20 years. And I think at the last count, there was something like 165 fresh expressions of various sorts in the diocese. And, under the old share system, people didn't include them, partly because there was a feeling that and I know this myself from being a parish priest, it's quite difficult these activities often cost more to put on than you received in donations back. But there comes a point, though, when you have to say that these are all part of the modern church, and we've got to be realistic about that. And there is a challenge always to disciple people, to move them on from being consumers of something you put on to actually engaging with our Lord Jesus Christ, and for that to start to really impact on their lives. And so we're suggesting that now is the time when, after 20 years of fresh expressions, that we really start to say, no, we've got to include them. This is the breadth of the church these days. It's a multifaceted thing, and some great work is happening in those services. And some lovely stories are emerging from them.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a really good and important question posted by Richard, which we'll certainly come back to, or indeed follow up with Bishop Stephen, as you say. But I'm going to just pause this part of the meeting for a moment to bring in Anna. And we're going to give Anna 5-10 minutes to just update us, and then we'll come back to further questions at the end. Anna, over to you. Thanks, Anthony.
Hello, everyone. Looking around the Zoom room, I recognise so many faces, so you probably all know me, or mostly all know me. And I've already had lots of meetings with you guys. If I haven't met with you, and even if I have, this is just a reminder that, Harry and I are here to help with fundraising and giving. I've said before, I'm going to say it again, I recognise that every church is different, but we're all facing similar challenges, and that's obviously raising the funds for share and keeping the church building in good order. And in an ideal world, this is the approach that I would take, that the congregation give the funds needed for ministry, and that we look again at grants from trusts and foundations to support the cost of repairs and reordering, and that the community are asked to fund the shortfall. It's a slightly different take on what I was saying before, insofar as I've work with so many churches now where we're sort of looking at putting together a strategic approach to capital projects, or anything really, where we look to see not only what everything is going to cost, but also where we think the funds are going to come from before we start fundraising. And what I'm looking slightly differently from previous advice is to identify a shortfall that we can go to the community for. So if you're interested in a sort of strategic approach in that way, then do contact me. I recognise that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and there are lots of different ways for our parishes to achieve the targets that we need to raise. Next slide, please, Will. So there are many different factors, although we've got lots of similarities. And when I come to meet you guys, I will look at, like, whether or not you're rural or suburban, town centre or housing estate, how many services you have, whether you're in a historic building or new, whether or not you have a church hall or other income generation opportunities. If you're in a small parish where everyone knows one another, if you've got farming or army background, because all of these things influence how we might approach a fundraising campaign. And what's a joy for me is that, wherever I go, somebody will say something and it'll ring a bell with me, and I'll think, oh, hold on a minute, I know another parish where they faced a similar, challenge, or they've had a success, and they played to their strengths. And so what I'm really hoping to do is come out with fresh eyes and with ideas that I can share from across the diocese, so we're not reinventing the wheel. Next slide, thank you. So getting our mechanisms has been a priority for me. Getting our mechanisms in place has been a priority for me for the last couple of years. And I'm sure that many of you were taking part in the national digital rollout over the last month. And I'm just so excited to have been able to award, I think we had 78 devices in the end to give away to churches. and we were oversubscribed. We thought we were going to have 70 devices, but in the end, National Church funded 78 devices, and the DBF has pledged to fund another 10 to parishes where connectivity was a real issue and they weren't going to be able to meet the national team's criteria in time to take part in the rollout. But they were really willing and really committed to getting connected in church. So Harry's supporting them, and there'll be another 10 churches receiving contactless devices. So that takes us up to around 88 contactless devices being offered in this month. And I know from talking to people how exciting that is, even if it feels a bit daunting. But we've got to future-proof our churches and make sure that people are able to give, with fewer people carrying cash. So the other areas that we're able to support you on are QR codes, online giving, joining the parish giving scheme, gifts in wills, looking at making pew envelopes more effective, and supporting the churches that are taking part in Ride and Stride. So if any of those things are interesting to you and you would like to find out more, then you know where I am. Next slide, thank you. Now, this is a really crucial one, and it's come up more and more, and I've started really focusing on it a lot, which is helping you write your case for support. Actually, this is so fundamental that I'm not sure, I don't know how we're doing without it, frankly. I would take you through a series of questions, including looking at what you need, which is what we mostly know, and what difference it will make, which we often don't talk about, how much it will cost, and sometimes, we're looking at things in a piecemeal kind of way, but I want to know what everything's going to cost. Let's start from what's everything we want, including a wish list. Let's aim high. And then crucially, looking at where the funds will come from. And this is the kind of process I would have gone through if I was writing a grant application or preparing to write grant applications. And I have written, that was my job before to the diocese, 6 years in grants funding. So, I can help you look at grant applications and make sure that they're hopefully as strong as they can be. But, crucially, that understanding your case for support is the core of everything for all fundraising. So whether or not you were going to make an approach to a major donor, or if you wanted to write a leaflet for your parish or your community, even if they're non-worshipping community, understanding your case for support is really crucial. And it's such a great bedrock. So let me help you with those. And sometimes just by me asking those questions, it generates so many exciting ideas. And I mean, I was where was I recently? I was with Jane Dunlop. She's going to have to remember. Oh, White Parish, sorry. So I was at White Parish recently. And, we started off looking at the letters that were written by Woodford Valley Church and the letters that they'd done, which were great. And then it generated all kinds of conversations about how we might think about who our audience is in White Parish and how we were going to ask them, and that it wasn't going to be just a one-time letter, actually, And we started talking about, how actually it's not just writing for a different audience, but it's also writing from different people. And so when I was talking with Jane, we were like, well, Jane would naturally want to write a more pastoral letter to the parish, but somebody else on the PCC wants to write, a heritage letter from the parish. And we were like, well, let's write several letters and let's do them over the course of a year. And, and I don't know if White Parish have decided that that's what they're going to do, but what great, what a great approach. Fundraising is all about building a relationship. So this isn't one letter and one leaflet, this is just building a relationship with the parish. And so, however we look to do that, we can think about who our different audiences are, as I've said there, and how we communicate with them. But also, I really love that idea of starting to look at who's doing the communicating and what they want to say. Next slide, thanks. So finally, I was sort of anticipating there'd be a lot of treasurers on our course tonight, although I've now recognised a lot of clergy too. And it's really important to say that this isn't just the responsibility of the treasurer, but treasurers play a crucial role. And what I would like us to have is the courage to invest in fundraising. That's the parable of the talents for me, and invest in growing the church. And that's the parable of the sower. So, I feel like it feels sometimes counterintuitive to spend money on communications, promoting what we're doing, literature, leaflets, those kinds of things. But actually, it's absolutely crucial to do that. So we have to have the courage to invest. And there's a lot of work that we're doing at the moment looking at how we go local. And as part of that, I'm looking to encourage you to think about how we give as a church. So how we use our giving to build relationships with, local organisations and grassroots organisations who are working in our parishes, doing what we might think of as ministry work, caring for people and looking to support people who, maybe are struggling financially, or, food banks, all kinds of things where, people are doing, great work, and especially at a local level. Most people are not doing those, running grassroots organisations for the money. They're doing it, I would say, even if they don't recognise it, because at their heart they've got Christian values. And so I'd really like us to seek out those organisations and support them and build genuine, honest, transparent, long-term relationships with them, real partnerships. Then it's as I'm always saying it, have really solid reserves policy. Sometimes a church might think they have too much money and can't apply for funds, but if you know what your operational budget is for the year, then you can ring fence that, and so it means that you can apply for funds that you think maybe you couldn't. And invest in future proofing. So we've done some work around data developments, which is the church accounting software. And I'm not a joke with people, but it's true. I love a spreadsheet, but other people's spreadsheets are awful. So if you're looking at succession planning, having your accounting all tidy in a data developments package, then I think is a real incentive for other people to might take it off you. So I would look at that. And finally, ask for help. Don't feel you need to know it all. I don't know it all. I have to start making that very clear. I don't have all of the answers. What I do have is lots of access to people across the whole diocese who are doing really great stuff, and there's loads for us to share and learn from. So I hope that's given you a bit of a flavour as to how the giving team can support over the coming few years.
Anna, thank you, and thank you for everything that you and Harry are doing across the diocese. Hugely appreciated. We have a few minutes left. Just to turn to Richard's question, it's an important question, and there are many dimensions, but I guess it shows up in the diocese in terms of our annual operating deficit, the difference between the responsibilities that we carry within the DBF budget and the income that comes either from those historic assets, about a quarter of the income, or from your share giving and fundraising. So this year, last year, year end is about £1.2 million deficit. We also just tried to get out of our COVID bank loan, 2.5 million that we borrowed to manage cash through the COVID crisis. How do we do that? Well, we sell houses. We sell houses, which means we withdraw from communities where we have had people in ministry before. And as you'll know, we're between exchange and completion in the sale of Church House right now as well. So we are selling our assets to cover that gap. So to some extent, the diocese is the squeeze middle. If there are reserves at a parish level, which some parishes do have, and assets at the church commissioner level, many parishes feel the squeeze with the responsibilities of share and the building, but the diocese collectively certainly is a squeezed position at the moment. I'm encouraged that Bishop Stephen is going to be vice chair of the church commissioners. He is now this year. I'm sure there'll be more conversations to be had. I think Save Our Parish raised lots of really good questions, and the essence of what they're looking for, I think, has real integrity. The belief that there's a silver bullet that means the church commissioners can just pay for everything, I think, is a fantasy, but time will tell.
Could I add to that a large part of the church commissioners' funds are set aside for pensions and for funding bishops and cathedral and ministries of canons in cathedrals and stuff. What's left, if it was used to fund the day-to-day costs of the Church of England, would last for 3 years. So they could do that, but then you're in a situation whereby there's no escaping the fact that today's ministry needs to be paid for by today's church going forward. They do talk about, is your diocese using total return? If it's not, then they're kidding you. Well, what they don't say in that is that to use total return, you actually have to sell the assets because you need the cash. When parish share doesn't come in, it's actually the cash that doesn't come in to the diocese, and therefore we need to generate cash to pay the bills. So you do have to actually sell assets to do so. We are again running a deficit of about 1.2 million. We did last year. It's going to be the same for 2023 and as it was in 2022. And there's a limit to how much that can go on. People say to me, yes, we've lost a lot of members since before COVID. We have, but what we haven't done yet is we haven't done what other dioceses have done, which is going for wholesale retrenchment, because we are concentrating on this vision and strategy for the future. And we want to say to people, can you respond generously towards this strategy and vision for the future? Because we don't want to have to reduce the numbers of priests in parishes. We want to be able to continue what we're doing and make Jesus known across the diocese.
Anthony, thank you for bringing it to that positive conclusion. And we believe firmly that as supported by Anna and through the learning that comes across the diocese, there are creative ways to inspire people to give and raise funds. There is money out there, and I'd like to express particular thanks to each of you for what you do in your community to inspire, encourage, and resource people in mission ministry and fundraising. We're going to draw to a close. I'm conscious there'll be further discussions if you're at Darton Synod on Saturday. Really value your feedback, but also don't hesitate to drop a line to Anna, myself, or Anthony if you have reflections on what you've heard or things that were on the tip of your tongue or come to you in the middle of the night in a charming nightmare. Feel free to let us know, and we like to stay in ongoing conversation with you. So thank you very much for being in this call today. And if you're in Heytesbury Deanery, I'll see you in about an hour and a half. Thank you very much. Cheers for now.